DCS Lost Wingman.
Okay, lead copy Lost Wingman. Lead is reference
Heading 30.
lead is reference 320 at 13.5.
2. 2300
Roger. Reference heading 330 now. And leads in the clear at 13.7. Okay, leads climbing to 14,000. Reference heading 340 now. Okay, lead is reference 340, 14,000 in the clear.
Is heading 320, 14.5. To lead in sight, request rejoin.
Roger, rejoin left side.
2.
Welcome back, DCS Hacks fans. It's Cabi 599 with the last chapter of our IP series, Basic Formation with GARF. In this chapter, we're going to cover some new terminology, lost wingman procedures, and recovery back to Nellis. What new terminology do we have? We have VMC, which is Visual Meteorological Conditions, also known as flying around in clear air, no weather. IMC is Instrument Meteorological Conditions, also known as flying in weather in clouds. If you ever hear the term Popeye, that means the pilot is flying in and out of clouds and is difficult to clear for VMC type traffic. What's the difference between lost wingman and blind? Lost wingman is the procedure and the call that you make if you are an IMC. In other words, you're flying through the weather in a formation and you lose sight of the leader. Blind is when you lose sight of the leader and you're in the clear weather and you lost sight of the leader and you need to rejoin the formation again. If you are in lost wingman procedures, you might or you will hear reference from the leader versus the term set. Reference is referencing headings and altitudes versus set is for power settings and airspeeds. Okay, reference versus set. Initial, or what the tower says to report initial, is to the overhead pattern, which we'll cover a little bit later on, and it's how you fly up and run up to the active runway at pattern altitude and then do an overhead break, also known as a pitch out. And it is a 180 degree heading change turn typically 60-degree bank at 2 Gs until you roll out on the opposite heading of the runway to inside downwind. There's generally a 5-second spacing between aircraft for the pitch out. The perch or the perch point is a location where you start descending and doing the final turn to the runway from inside downwind. And that perch point is typically at a 45-degree angle from the threshold while you are on inside downwind. AOA is angle of attack, and that is the angle of attack of the wing to the relative wind, and that is not the body or deck angle, fuselage angle of the aircraft, nor is it the pitch from your attitude indicator, which can be totally different from the angle of attack of the wing to the relative wind. Okay? And we'll give you a little primer on that for those of you who have never used it before or are unfamiliar and don't know how to use it. So let's take a look at lost wingman procedures. There are 3 basic lost wingman procedures: straight and level flight, leader turning into the wingman, leader turning away from the wingman, and then rejoins. If you are in straight and level flight in the fingertip position as you're traveling through the weather and you lose sight of the leader, 1, make the call, 2 is lost wingman, and then in order to separate the aircraft so that you don't bump into each other and kill each other, one of you needs to turn, and in general it's going to be, in this case, the wingman, number 2, will go into a 30-degree bank turn and turn away from the leader and try to get at least a 30-degree heading separation from the leader. Then you'll call out your heading and your altitude, and the leader will give a reference to the leader's heading and altitude, and then be directive as to how to rejoin the aircraft back into formation. If the leader is turning towards the wingman, the easiest thing to do here is for the wingman to continue the turn and make the separation. So you make the call, 2 is lost wingman, lead, roll out. And when the leader rolls out, the wingman continues the turn and makes a separation. Leader gives the heading reference and altitude and is directive as to what he or she wants the wingman to do in order to rejoin the formation. If the aircraft or if the leader is turning away from the wingman, the easiest thing to do in this case is make the call, and then the wingman will roll wings level, allowing the leader to continue the turn and making the separation. Then lead will give a reference heading and altitude and be directive as to how to rejoin the formation. As far as rejoining the formation, it's going to be a straight ahead rejoin, but it can also be a turning rejoin. However, you don't want to be turning into a cloud bank trying to rejoin the formation if you can help it. The recovery phase back to Nellis, the RTB, return to base. Let's take a look at what initial and the overhead pattern looks like, what the spacing for that looks like, and also where to brake, how to brake, and how to do that pitch out, how to determine when you reach the perch point, and how to fly this final turn using the angle of attack indicator. And then landing on the runway, which side, the hot side or the cold side? Which side is which? And then we'll talk about taxi back as we're doing it in the demo video. Okay, the overhead pattern, this is right out of the Air Force's manual for the T-38. Initial is typically 2 to 3 miles, but it can be as far as 5 miles prior to the runway. And it's what's running up to the runway at pattern altitude, runway heading, until you reach the brake zone, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, because I've got over 1,500 hours in a T-38, and the T-38 and the F-5 have the same general DNA and even have essentially the same type of engine, I have always flown the T-38 in a 2,000-foot pattern, vice 1,500-foot pattern that I've seen on YouTube from other people. At 2,000 feet, you just fly runway heading until you get overhead the runway, normally at 300 knots, which is approximately 85% RPM, until you get to the brake zone, which is typically the first third of the runway. Once you're in the brake zone, the leader will brake and separate from the wingman using a 60-degree bank 2G turn and reduce power to 80%. This will help the aircraft decelerate. The bank angle in G's as well as the reduced power will also decelerate the aircraft so that you can get below the gear limiting speed. For the F5 is 260 knots. And then you'll be on inside downwind. It will look like this. Once again, 5-second spacing between aircraft. And in general, 2 Gs, 60 degrees of bank. And the wingman will always go slightly outside of the leader's ground track. Now, if you're in the 60-degree bank turn and you're climbing, all you have to do is maintain the pull and just roll into a little bit more bank, maybe 70, maybe 80 degrees of bank, until you stop climbing and start descending back to your altitude. Obviously, if you're descending, you come out of some of the bank while you maintain the pull, 50 to 45 degrees of bank until you climb back up to pattern altitude. Now, field elevation over at Nellis is 1,800 feet, so we're going to be flying a 3,800 foot pattern. And that's 3,800 feet MSL. If you roll out from a 300 knot 60 degree bank turn, the spacing will look like this. And if you look on the far left, that's my missile rail. The leading edge of my missile rail is actually lined up with the landing runway with the 2,000 foot spacing. If you happen to be flying a 1,500 foot pattern, that spacing, or I should say the runway, should be somewhere above your missile rail. Okay? Now at that point, how are you going to determine the perch point is when you reach a 45 degree angle from the threshold while you are on inside downwind spacing, proper spacing. The perch point in the F5 will be basically when the threshold is going underneath the leading edge of your wingtip. You are at the 45 degree point, and then now you can lower the nose and roll into a bank to do your final turn. And to do that, you're going to use, in DCS at least, for the 2,000 foot pattern, I use about 80 to 82% RPM. In the demo video, I'll be 81% around the final turn. I trim the aircraft for the green donut, and we'll discuss that in a moment. And about 35 to 40 degrees of bank works best in DCS for the F5. So let's talk a little bit about the angle of attack indicator. This instrument, or the indexer, is what's commonly referred to as the donut display. And this is the most common in the military type of display. Now in the Air Force, the donut is green. There's a red chevron on top and a yellow chevron on the bottom. If you're in the Navy, it's probably an amber donut, and I believe they have a green chevron on top and a red chevron on the bottom. So it doesn't really matter what service you're flying if you have an indexer like this on the glare shield, and they put it there so that you have to use it. The green donut, or I should say the donut, actually represents your optimum angle of attack. This is typically 1.3 times your stall speed, or 30% prior to your stall. The red chevron, which is actually pointing down, it's an arrow pointing down saying your nose or your angle of attack is too high. You need to reduce the angle or lower the nose until you get back to the green donut. The yellow chevron saying that you're at a low angle of attack and you need to raise the nose to get back to the green donut, which is optimum angle of attack. Once you have the green donut, you just pitch up or down to maintain the green donut around that final turn. And when you adjust the power, you change the glide path angle of the aircraft. In other words, if your impact point happens to be right on the numbers like in that diagram that I'm showing here, if you add power, it'll move your impact point away from you. If you retard the throttle, it'll bring the impact point towards you. That's how you adjust the power in order to adjust where you're going to land on the runway. As you approach the actual threshold, you're going to be reducing the power back to idle, and you're going to increase the angle of attack such that you're going to get the red chevron as you're touching down at a higher angle of attack. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need to use the speed brakes or the air brakes to do this pattern, especially from a 2,000-foot pattern, nor do you need to use the drogue chute if you do this pattern properly and maintain the green donut all the way to touchdown. But remember, touchdown in the red chevron, because you need to round out and flare and not crash into the deck like the Navy guys do. This diagram is showing, for one, the steam gauge, as we call it, in the cockpit. The F-5 is one of the few aircraft that actually uses degrees. So you can see that the optimum angle of attack is at 15 degrees AOA. Now, angle of attack has nothing to do with speed, not really. Okay, so angle is in degrees, speed is in knots. So really, this should say optimum AOA. That 15-degree angle is what we're looking for. Now, the diagram with the aircraft and the lines, arrows, is a bit, shall we say, exaggerated. But what it is showing is that if you have a lighter aircraft with a known optimum angle of attack, you don't have to fly as fast because you don't need to generate as much lift to lift the excess weight. The diagram here showing 12,000-pound aircraft versus the 21,000-pound, which obviously needs more velocity to generate more lift, yet it's still at the same angle of attack, 15 degrees in this case. When you roll out on final, the side of the runway that you will be taxiing off of is commonly referred to as the cold side, and obviously the opposite of that is the hot side. Now, I like to land on the center line and then I'll drift over to the cold side so that I can taxi off the runway. And if your wingman's landing long and hot, typically you want to land on the hot side of the runway. So if you have to overrun your leader or one of the other wingmen who's trying to turn off the runway, you're not going to run into them and have an accident on the runway. Okay? So let's take a look at the video.
Two is Lost Wingman.
Lead copy, Lost Wingman. Lead is reference 140, 12,500.
Two is 170, 12,200. Leading site, request rejoin.
Rejoin, right side.
Two.
Now, luckily we broke out of the weather and we were able to do the rejoin, but if we had still been in the weather, leader would have been directive as to what he or she wanted the wingman to do in order to maintain that separation, and then later on to rejoin the aircraft. The cloud banks here, the cloud decks are relatively thin, so we could have both easily climbed up to a specific altitude. And generally speaking, when the leader pops out of the weather, he'll direct the wingman to fly a certain heading and also at a certain altitude to maintain vertical and horizontal separation until the wingman can find or see the leader and execute the rejoin. Now, if they're having trouble finding each other, they can actually use air-to-air TACAN, or the leader can point out a ground reference to overfly and set up opposing orbits at different altitudes. Now, it's difficult to practice Lost Wingman in the weather, so we're trying to stay below the weather in the MOA out here. And obviously we're in a left-hand turn, so we're turning away from the wingman at this point. Do you guys remember what the procedure is, turning away from the wingman? Two, go practice Lost Wingman.
2, practicing Lost Wingman. Heading 990, 11,800.
Leads reference heading 170, 11,800.
Lead in sight, request rejoin.
Rejoin, right side.
2,
Now note that we're using the term practice Lost Wingman. It's much better to practice Lost Wingman while you're in VMC, because when you're actually in IMC and you lose sight of the leader like Garth did on the first one, it can be very disorienting having to transition from watching your leader and trying to stay in formation to transitioning to your instruments and trying to determine what your attitude and heading and altitude is. So we try to practice this as much as possible in VMC before you actually have to do it for real in IMC. Now, the only time I've ever had to do an actual Lost Wingman procedure was in a T-37 that I was instructing in, and I was actually watching my leader's wingtip light. In the weather, that was the only thing I could see was his wingtip light, and I just tried to keep that wingtip light in the same position in my windscreen until it suddenly disappeared. And we were a straight and level flight, so all I had to do was go into 30 degrees of bank and make my separation from the leader. And just like in the first procedure that Garth did, we eventually just popped out of the weather, and we were only maybe a quarter of a mile from each other. So we were able to rejoin rather quickly after that. Now we're trying to stay out of the weather to get the other practice Lost Wingman, which will be the turning into the wingman. But we are down at the bottom of the area with clouds basically above us, so we're setting up for a turn towards the wingman. And can you guys remember what the procedure is for that? Two, go practice Lost Wingman.
Practice Lost Wingman to lead roll out.
Lead roll out, that's the appropriate term. And lead reference heading 180, 12,000, correction, 11,800.
2, heading 200, 11,500. Lead in sight, request rejoin.
Rejoin, right side.
2. 2's Joker.
Lead copy Joker. Dragon sweep ATIS, go channel 3.
2.
Joker is a
Time
predetermined fuel.
2300 Zulu. Current ceilings view at 8,000, visibility greater than 10 miles. Winds, 240 at 5, altimeter 2993. Runway 21 ILS in use. Advise you have information Quebec. Nellis Air Force Base information Quebec. Time 2300.
Dragon flight check.
2's Bingo.
Approach Dragon 55 flight R4806, request RTB Nellis with information Quebec.
Dragon 55 flight, Nellis approach, proceed direct to Nellis, descend at pilot's discretion to 10,000, advise canceling IFR.
Dragon 55 flight, direct Nellis, pilot's discretion 10,000, Wilco canceling. And bingo is the minimum fuel to return back to the base. Approach Dragon 55 flight, cancel IFR.
Dragon 55 flight, Nellis approach, cancellation received, frequency change approved, contact Nellis Tower.
Dragon flight, push tower. Dragon flight check.
2.
Tower, Dragon 55 flight 10 north en route initial runway 21.
Dragon 55 flight. Nellis Tower, report a 2-mile initial to runway 21 left.
Dragon flight. And as we start maneuvering towards the initial, you can see Garf starting to tuck in real tight, looking real nice now. Wants to put on a good show for the people down on the ground. And you can see Nellis there on the right at the right edge of the screen as we approach 2-mile initial. Tower, Dragon flight's 2-mile initial.
Dragon 55 flight. Nellis Tower, you're number 1 for runway 21 left. Report base.
Dragon flight. Garf's looking real good here. Okay, about a mile initial. And approaching the break zone. Okay, remember, just adjust your bank angle to control your climb and or descent in order to do your best 60-degree 2G level turn. Looking for that missile rail on the runway. Make sure you're not driving towards the runway or away from the runway, but paralleling it. Okay, my gear's down, 3 green, flaps are at auto, flaps are at full. I've got about 82% right now set, and setting 81%. There's my perch point. I lower the nose and go into 45 degrees of bank initially.
Dragon
Roll
55 lead is left base gear stop.
Dragon 55 flight. Nellis Tower, winds are 230 at 5, clear to land.
Dragon lead, clear to land. Now I'm just trimming to maintain the green donut. Like it says, I need to pitch the nose up. There we go, trimming it, maintain the green donut. Note that I have not even spoken anything about airspeed.
Dragon 2 left base gear stop.
Dragon 55 2, Nellis Tower, winds are 230 at 6, clear to land.
Dragon 2, clear to land.
Okay, rolling out on final. I need to raise the nose to get back on the green donut. There's a 3-degree glide path. That's what a 3-degree glide path looks like. And I just adjust the power accordingly to determine where I'm going to land on the runway. And I'm having to reduce power because it looked like I had a long aim point initially. Remember, land with the red chevron so you don't crash into the runway. On the center line, and I'll drift myself to the cold side of the runway. Garf's looking like about a 2 to 2.5 degree glide path. Need to raise the nose to get back to the green donut. Throttles the idle. And he greases it on the runway on the green donut. And it looks like I'm going to the end.
55 flight, Nellis Tower, contact runway north.
Now, lead perspective, I'm going to use a little bit of wingman consideration. Take the right-hand side of the taxiway line so that my wingman can be on the upwind side when we taxi back. And lead's waiting for the wingman. You normally taxi out as a formation and taxi back as a formation. Dragonflight, push, ground. Dragonflight, check.
2.
Ground, Dragon 5-5 flight off of 2-1 left, taxi to park.
Dragon 5-5 flight, Nellis ground, cross 2-1 right, taxi to park via Alpha.
Dragonflight, cross 2-1 right, taxi to park. Okay, canopies coming up together. And once we're in the shelters together, we shut down together as a formation. And that ends our video for Chapter 5. Thanks everybody for joining us on our little IP series for basic formation. Don't forget to smash the like and the subscribe button for Garfy there. And don't forget,